welcome everyone to the Center for the Blue Economy, Environmental Justice and Sustainability Speaker Series. We have with us tonight our speaker, Dr. Ari Friedlaender. He is the principal investigator and founder of the Friedlaender Lab, Bio-Telemetry and Behavioral Ecology at UC Santa Cruz, and he's also a professor of ocean sciences. And also with us tonight, and introducing him further, will be Dr. Jason Skorse, who is the Center for the Blue Economy Director and also Chair of the International Environmental Policy Program at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. And this course is a class at MISS, as we like to call it, for those students in the International Environmental Policy Program who are interested in ocean and coastal resource management. So this topic tonight will be right up their alley and or right down their blue corridor. I don't know, that's going sideways. But as the name of our since we started this speaker series, along with the founding of the center, along with the founding of that ocean coastal resource management specialization, it's always been open to the public as well. So we're very happy to have members of the public with us here tonight. And the students, this was called the Sustainability Speaker Spirit Series. It became the Environmental Justice and Sustainability Speaker Series at the students' request. And the students have also been instrumental in kind of creating this tradition of a land acknowledgement, and I'm so glad they have. So before I turn it over to Jason, we'd like to acknowledge the land that we are on, literally the land beneath our feet, our beautiful planet, as well as all of the people who came before us, and especially the indigenous peoples of this area. The Monterey Bay was called the Achasta, and here where the Middlebury Institute is located in Monterey, California, the indigenous peoples were known as the Esselen, also the Ohlone, Costanoan, Selenian, the Rumsen. There were about 27 different tribes all along the Monterey Bay. So we acknowledge their wisdom and we acknowledge their leadership and their influence on the environmental movement today, and hope that going beyond land acknowledgements, we continue to offer reparations in one way or the others. At Middlebury Institute, we offer scholarship, and I hope that our governments continue to give land back and continue to honor our indigenous people. And so with that, one other thing, as students, you can keep your cameras on. We always really appreciate that. And members of the public, if you are comfortable doing so, we just like to have our faces so that our speaker can see our reactions. Keep your microphones muted. And we also have interpreters tonight. So if you'd like to listen to Dr. Friedlaender's lecture in Chinese, feel free to click that interpretation icon on the bottom of the Zoom toolbar. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jason.
All right, thanks, Rachel, and good to see everybody here. You know, part of this introduction, I just want to tell a little personal anecdote. You know, when I think, you know, I grew up in New York City in the 1970s, and my parents were a little eclectic, and they had this record. It was records back then, vinyl records, and it was the songs of the humpback whale. And it had a booklet. You know, records were big, and they had paper booklets often in them. And in it, there were these really extreme images of whales being harpooned and killed in commercial whaling. And, you know, I was probably 6 or 7 years old when I was looking through this. And then I was listening to these sounds. If you haven't heard the humpback whale, that album that I'm referring to is on Spotify. You can listen to it. It's just really haunting, amazing stuff, listening to these animals, you know, singing basically symphonies over thousands of miles in the deep ocean. And so I think that's what really sparked my interest in kind of the ocean and the environment, you know, from something that really was the antithesis being in, you know, urban industrial, you know, Manhattan. And then obviously also many of you know, whales were kind of the iconic species that really launched a lot of the environmental movement in the 70s and the fight and the battles against commercial whaling. And just to put this in context, and Dr. Friedlaender has much more knowledge about this, but, you know, commercial whaling killed 90 to 99% of many of the iconic whale species. I mean, we literally almost wiped off the face of the earth hundreds and thousands of these mighty creatures that had lived for millions of years. So it's just an incredible turnaround that we brought them back from extinction. But as this talk will show, our work is not done. And as Dr. Friedlaender is going to point out, we really need to update our conservation paradigm. And that's why we're so excited to have him here tonight to talk about that, because I think everybody here will agree that, you know, as a species, if we can't protect the whales and make sure they're flourishing, that's certainly a big strike against our own species. So with that, Dr. Friedlander, thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us.
Yeah, thank you, Jason, and thank you, Rachel. Those were wonderful words, and I appreciate the land acknowledgement and the opportunity to talk with you guys. The Migratory Institute obviously has a phenomenal reputation for producing leaders in ocean conservation. And one of the things that I hope we kind of get through in this talk today is a bit of biology, a bit of ecology, and how we study these animals, but how we use that information then to decide on what's important and where is important to try and conserve and protect, and sort of put this forth as a challenge for the generation that is learning right now, which is you guys, to take the lead and the example and the things that we have learned sort of in my generation, and make better use of it and make decisions that are more informed for the long haul. And so let me just start sharing my screen now, and here we go. Okay. And we'll get off and running, hopefully. Okay, I'm just going to minimize a bunch of stuff here, but if there are any questions, somebody just kind of chime in or yell or say something. I'm a professor in ocean sciences at UC Santa Cruz. Like was mentioned, I've also co-founded the California Ocean Alliance, which is a local nonprofit that's focused on marine conservation and education. And what I want to talk tonight about is how we use whales to consider and represent healthy oceans and the technology that we use to study and conserve those. And my email address is down there in the bottom left. And if anybody has any questions that don't get answered or any other reason to chat with me, by all means, please reach out. Obviously, the work that gets done on cetaceans, as you guys know, in ocean conservation in general, takes a mighty, mighty village. And the research that I'm going to talk to you guys about tonight has supported over 100 undergraduate and graduate students, as well as postdocs, and has been funded by a variety of organizations, largely by the National Science Foundation, but the International Whaling Commission, the World Wildlife Fund, as well as places like the Office of Naval Research, National Geographic Foundation, so on and so forth. And I think what this illustrates is that when we do this kind of conservation work, we need support from a number of different sectors, those that support basic science, those that support applied research, and those that help to promote sort of the broader impacts or the context around promoting conservation from science. And so I'm really glad that we have these partners that span that spectrum of ideas and ideals. What's really great about what Jason said is I have sort of a similar history personality-wise. I grew up in Connecticut, and I grew up in an area where the Yankee whaling industry really shaped the economic and cultural foundation of the area. Places like New Bedford and Mystic and Boston and in Rhode Island, the lights were literally lit with the oil of whales for a couple of hundred years. And you grow up in a place like that, and there's a very deep-rooted connection to whales. Although it was a consumptive thing, they were very valuable. And so it was really interesting to grow up in a place where I knew about whales, but I didn't know why they were really important or how they were utilized. I did my undergraduate at Bates College up in Maine. I did my master's work in anatomy and functional morphology at University of North Carolina. And this was really important because I learned how marine mammals are put together, how their anatomy has evolved for life in the ocean, and how to take advantage of the resources there. From there, I moved on to Duke University, where I got my PhD in ecology. And there is where I sort of started to learn about how animals interact with and relate to their environment. And the ocean environment, being a three-dimensional space, offers a really interesting set of complex challenges for how you understand where animals go and what they do. It was at this point that I started going to the Antarctic as well. And I was very fortunate to get involved in research during my dissertation for this, and have turned that into sort of a long-term project. One of the things that has come full circle is this guy in the upper right here, Nathaniel Palmer, was the first gentleman to set foot on the Antarctic continent in 1821. And he grew up about 15 miles east of where I grew up in Connecticut. And so unbeknownst to me, I was growing up in an area that had a rich cultural history of whaling, as well as Antarctic exploration. And so I like to think that some of that may have seeped into me at an early age. In terms of my sort of philosophy for how I think about science, the understanding of anatomy and physiology of animals helps us to understand their behavior. And once we understand an animal's behavior, putting that in the context of its environment is really what ecology is all about. And these three disciplines, I think, really overlap very nicely. And this is what my lab and my students have largely focused on. And in order to do this kind of research on whales, I'm going to talk about this in great detail, we require technologies, things like echo sounders, which are traditional technologies that allow us to see in the water column and how much prey is present, to tag technology and these new ideas of putting biologgers on animals that tell you about what animals do below the surface. And these are the tools that we've used to start to understand how these animals exist in their ecosystem. And the output from this is obviously things like scientific papers and reports. But the two most critical things, I think, are education, either at the undergraduate, graduate level, high school, primary school, and the greater community, and then using this information and this knowledge, which is really what allows us to make good decisions, to adapt and generate sound conservation and management practices. And having that scientific basis for conservation planning, I think, is absolutely critical. And I'm glad that the work that we are doing has this nice positive feedback where the more we learn, the more we can appropriately develop these conservation tools and management strategies that then allow us to go back and do some more refined work to better understand what the risks are to these animals. So you guys are the perfect endpoint for a lot of this information that we're trying to generate to translate this into something that's effective to alter human behavior in a way that minimizes risk for these animals. Okay, so why use whales and why study whales? I think there's a number of really important reasons. First is that I think they're a good model for testing these fundamental principles of biology and ecology and physiology. We've learned a lot about optimal foraging theory, how the energetics of the biggest animals on the planet work, how the physiological constraints of mammals that need to breathe air but live in the ocean, how that works. These are all really important questions at a basic scientific level. I think also what I want to sort of convey today is that the presence of whales reflects the emergent properties of healthy ocean ecosystems. And by that, what I mean is, if a whale is sort of the ultimate predator that has the most enormous energetic needs, in order to sustain a single whale or a population of whale, the environment needs to have all of the things happening in order, in succession, and in a way that promotes biological growth in a healthy way to support these animals. So Monterey Bay is one of these fantastic places where we have a ton of whales. And because of that, it allows us to use it as a model marine ecosystem for what those drivers are that create the conditions for whales to be present. And then lastly, or not lastly, second to lastly, whales, because of this, are sentinels of changing environments or changing climates. As whales move where their prey resources are or where ocean conditions are suitable for them, the places that they are not, we can think of as places that are not suitable for the animals. And if it goes from being suitable to unsuitable, that should send a red flag that there's something changing in the environment that doesn't allow these animals to be able to persist there. And then, like Jason mentioned in his introduction, we as humans in society care about whales for their societal value. They offer huge economic incentives for things like whale watching, which are billion-dollar industries, even here in Monterey Bay, as well as this heuristic value of animals being able to exist just for their own being. And The Marine Mammal Protection Act, which actually predates the Endangered Species Act, literally speaks to this, that marine mammals were given this opportunity to have federal protection simply because they were marine mammals and because we thought that they were important, not even if they were at risk of anything, but proactively, they and their habitats were protected by humans. So now stepping back in deep ecological time, one of the things I think is really cool about the ocean is that over the last 100 million years, there's been this independent evolution of large animals in the ocean that feed on very small things by filter feeding. So things like manta rays, things like whale sharks, basking sharks, a megamouth shark, and a baleen whale have all evolved a similar feeding strategy, which has allowed them to grow really, really big. And the reason for this is, if you think about energy and biomass in the ocean, the primary producers are the greatest biomass. And then right above that, the primary consumers, phytoplankton, zooplankton, krill, small fishes, there's a huge biomass of those relative to bigger fish. So if you want to grow big and you have to have big energetic needs, you want to feed on what's the most abundant, and that is these lower trophic organisms. And this bears out in the evolutionary record with all of these animals independently coming up with a filter feeding strategy to take out thousands and thousands and millions of these very small animals through either ram feeding and having food pass by gills where it gets caught, or by gulping and taking lunges like a baleen whale. Now, baleen whales evolved in the fossil record about 35 million years ago. Whales and marine cetaceans in general evolved from land animals that went back into the sea. They were toothed animals at first, but eventually they started to evolve this feeding mechanism of baleen, which are these very tightly sort of rowed, hanging vertical sort of comb bristles inside the mouth of the animal that allows them to take a large mouthful of water, push that water out, and sieve out these very small particles. The reason that baleen evolved as a feeding strategy, if you look on this graph about 35 million years ago when the first mystacete or baleen whales evolved, it was at a time in the Oligocene when something called the Antarctic Circumpolar Current was established. So the Antarctic continent had moved down to the southern part of the planet, and there is now a persistent current of water around the southern continent, around the southern hemisphere, called the circumpolar current. This current actually produces a lot of upwelling and mixing of nutrient-rich water in an area where you have a lot of sunlight, which promotes a lot of primary production of phytoplankton, which then allows for zooplankton and those small fish and crustaceans to grow. And once there was a stable food base, baleen evolved as a foraging strategy. Now, if you look on that top row there, you look at the total length in meters, the first baleen whales were pretty small. They were 5 or 6 meters long. And it's only in the last 2 or 3 million years that whales have actually grown to be the size that they are today. So a modern blue whale that can be up to 100 feet long, or a fin whale that's 80 feet long, only evolved that large body size in the last couple thousand or couple million years, largely because things like coastal upwelling and glacial cycles have become more dominant. The west coast of the US and South America has a very predominant upwelling system that routinely brings food up to the surface or nutrients up to the surface and promotes this primary productivity, which has allowed the biomass of food to grow to the point that baleen whales can actually be supported by this. So we are living in the time of the largest animals that have ever existed because of these conditions. Now, if you wanted to study whales and their behavior, the thing you'd want to do is emulate someone like Jane Goodall, who is probably the most accomplished and amazing and respected naturalist in the world. She can literally go out with a pencil and a pad of paper and watch these chimpanzees continuously and understand their behavior, understand their interactions with one another, look at how they vary their behavior relative to the context of their environment, and see how things in their environment affect what the animals do. Now, I'm not that wise, and I chose to try and study animals that spend about 95% of their lives underwater. And because of that, we have to get a little creative for how we actually can study these animals. And what this graphic shows here is that these are a number of technologies here on the right that are critical to study baleen whales, and in total are the things that you need to do in order to study these animals in a similar way to if you just wanted to observe animals in nature. Things like using satellites for remote sensing of the environment, using drones like this image here to measure the body size and body condition of animals, acoustics to look at the calls and the ways that animals communicate with one another, tag technology like I'll talk about that gives us an idea about what animals do underwater, biopsy sampling that tells us about the sex and the pregnancy status of animals. It takes all of these technologies to come together to be able to learn about these animals in very rudimentary and fundamental ways. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is how we have gone from wanting to understand how much a baleen whale eats, a very simple process. How much does a whale eat? Well, you can watch and see how much a chimpanzee eats in a day. In order to do this with a baleen whale, you need to put tags on the animal that allow you to reconstruct and quantify how many times they feed in a day. Then you need to be able to look at imagery of these animals and measure the volume of their mouth and see how much water they can actually get in their mouth at one time. And then you need to link that to how much food is in their environment through things like echo sounders and what's the density of food like. And once you do that, you can start to estimate how much they eat. And it seems like a relatively straightforward process, which it is, but in practice, it's been very difficult to do logistically. And so I'm going to walk through how we have learned this about baleen whales and how that has taken us to a knowledge of their ecological importance and the need for conservation of their habitats. So we recently published a paper in Nature where we used data from over 10 years of field work around the world from over 300 tag deployments on 7 or 8 different species of whales. And what this image is really representative of is that this is literally a worldwide study, and it took a village or a massive community of people to be able to collect all this data to the point that we could make some really concrete statements about baleen whale feeding. This is a really cool graphic that shows to scale all of the different baleen whale species that we work with. Many of these species are found right here in Monterey Bay. The blue whale on the left, the largest animal on the planet, the Antarctic minke whale on the right, the smallest of the baleen whales. And in Monterey Bay here, we get blue whales and fin whales and humpback whales and gray whales and even some minke whales here. So we live in a place with extremely high diversity of these animals. But to me, this is a great image to show sort of the difference in body plans and size and how these animals scale and what parts get big as others get small, depending on your overall body size. So the way that we study their underwater movement is by using technology of biologgers. The tag that's down here on the bottom left, we've worked with a company in Australia to develop over the past 10 or so years. These tags are non-invasive. They stick to the animal for 1 or 2 days at a time with suction cups. And the tags measure time, depth, and temperature, as well as measuring the acceleration of the animals in 3 axes. So the pitch of the animal up and down, the roll over to one side, or the heading change in a compass direction. As well, they have magnetometers and gyroscopes that allow us to help reconstruct the motion path of the animal in a 3-dimensional environment. The sensors sample at up to 400 times a second, which is very, very fast, which allows us to see in very good detail the kinematics or the motion of these animals underwater. These tags also record audio so we can hear the sounds that the animals are making as well as the sounds that they're receiving. And these tags also collect video so we can see from the animal's perspective what's the environment like and what is the context around some of the behaviors that we see in the tag record. The tag then also is able to georeference itself with a GPS and has a VHF transmitter so that when the tag falls off, it falls off, floats to the surface. This little antenna sticks up. We go out and pick up the tag and download all of the data from the tag. We can then recharge the battery and put this out again. So this gives us a very good fine detail look at a day in the life of a whale. And if we put these on a number of animals and a number of species and in a bunch of locations, we can start to say some things about how animals behave. So here's how we do the business part, which is the real fun part. This is putting a tag on an Antarctic minke whale on the Antarctic Peninsula. The tag sits on a little cradle at the end of about a 20-foot carbon fiber pole. I stand in the front of the pulpit of this small boat. We try and get near the whale. Hopefully it wants to volunteer to be part of our study. And you just slap the tag on the back of the whale. Nice thing about these tags is they really don't affect the behavior of the animal. So the animals are doing what they naturally would do once the tag is deployed on them. Here's putting a tag on a blue whale off of Santa Barbara. I've now got a camera on a helmet of mine. This blue whale has just come up from a long, deep dive, so it's taking a number of breaths at the surface to regain its oxygen stores. we're approaching the animal very, very slowly from an angle so that we don't go over the flukes. And then once we get close enough that it looks like we're going to get an opportunity, you'll see that we accelerate up and put the tag right on its back. So the next time the animal surfaces, we'll probably accelerate. There we go. There's the acceleration. There's the tag going on. There's this beautiful image of this massive blue whale. Again, the largest animals on the planet. It's an absolute privilege to be able to work with these animals and get up this close to them. You can barely see the tag on the animal when it surfaces, just to get an idea about scale and how big these whales are relative to the instruments that we're putting on them. Now, one of the things that's great when we get the tags on the animals, they turn into cinematographers for us. So in this case, we're on the back of a humpback whale in a super group of 200 whales off the coast of South Africa. You can see all the krill in the water column that's clearing up, or that's kind of looks like snow there. And you saw that humpback whale take that massive gulp of food right in front of us. We see things like sea lions as well. So we get an idea about who is in the environment around the animals. This is one from closer to home. This is a humpback whale in Monterey Bay. This is one of my favorite little video clips going through this beautiful kind of asteroid field of sea nettles. And it gives us, again, this perspective of why animals are doing certain things if we can see from their perspective what the environment is like. And in this case, there's this group of hundreds of California sea lions that are foraging in the same area as these humpback whales. So some of the things that the animal does are going to be affected by things around it, like the presence of these seals and the presence of other animals. And it just gives us a greater view and a greater appreciation for what it looks like to be a whale in this environment. Another bit of environmental context that we can use. Now we're on the back of a minke whale in the Antarctic. And what you can see at the surface, we're on the left-hand side of this animal. What you can see at the surface is sea ice. And so this video is critical for us because it allows us to say, how does this animal use an environment that is covered in ice? Clearly, the animal is able to find a little bit of a breathing hole. And so by measuring the sea ice and measuring where the whale goes, we can look at the dependency of this kind of a species on something like sea ice. And this is critical in an environment that's changing rapidly, where sea ice is diminishing. If we can get a good understanding of how critical that ice is and how it affects the behavior of the animals, we can develop much better conservation and management strategies to take advantage of that knowledge. And I'll just let this video play one more time. You'll see the animal go down into this really beautiful little lunge feed as it accelerates and opens its mouth in this little patch of krill. So it's about to go on a little dive here. In the upper left, you can see the orientation of the whale. And then down below, you don't have to pay too much attention. Those are the different sensors. The animal's speeding up. It opens its mouth right there. It takes a big gulp of krill and water, and it's going to be on its way. So really fascinating to be able to see, sort of from the back of the animal, what the environment is like and how it takes advantage of that. Another thing we can do is to take the track of the animal and put it into a three-dimensional space and look and see how the animals use the volume of water that they're in. So what this ribbon shows you is the actual orientation of a humpback whale. So as the ribbon turns, that is actually the animal turning onto its side. The blue and the red triangles that you see are when the whale is actively using its flukes. The yellow is just when the animal rolls over onto its side. But what this allows you to do is, rather than seeing on a flat, two-dimensional plane, how does the animal navigate through an environment? In this case, it's finding a patch of krill, it's accelerating through it, and then it's turning around and going back through it as well. And so what's great is you can get an idea about, oh my goodness, the animal's going back and forth through a prey patch at the same depth. And then you see the animal starts to kick as it goes back up to the surface. And it gives us just this very simplistic, but also very visceral understanding of how these whales use space, because you can see it if you see it in motion and relate to it, I think, a little bit better. And one of the things that this has allowed us to do is to look at individuality in whales. And in the upper left, you see these kind of spirals of bubbles. This is a very specific kind of feeding strategy that humpback whales do called bubble net feeding, where they go down below a patch of prey and blow a certain number of rings of bubbles around that prey patch to help consolidate it and move it towards the surface. And then the whale comes up in the middle of that and feeds. This is oftentimes a behavior that's done in groups where individuals have roles that are very well defined. And on the bottom panel on the left here, what you see are the feeding strategies of 7 different individual whales. So for example, 189B-04 comes in from the bottom right, and it does kind of 2 loops at the same depth and then comes up. The next one over looks like it does 1, 2, 3 spirals and comes to the surface. The next one over does 2 spirals before it comes to the surface. The one on the far right doesn't really look like it knows what it's doing. And that may be a young animal that's just kind of figuring things out and hasn't developed its own individual kind of trademark feeding style. But it allows us to see that all whales aren't the same and they do things individually, which is really a unique thing. Now, on the right, the thing I want you to look at is that bottom graph that has sort of 3 different bars on it. And what this is showing is we measured whether whales were left-handed or right-handed. And what's really interesting is that all vertebrates share the same commonality of having a right side bias for many of the repeated behaviors that you do, especially things like feeding. And what we found with whales was about 90% of the whales are right-handed. They blow bubbles to the right or they roll onto their right side when they feed. About 8 or 9% are left-handed. And then there's a little bit of ambiguity in a few animals. And these proportions or ratios are very similar to handedness in humans, where you have about 85 or 90% right-handed versus about 8 or 10% left-handed. So again, we're starting to see some commonalities in the things that whales do that help us relate to them as humans. Okay, so now that we've figured out how these whales feed, the next thing that we want to do is to be able to say, how do they feed relative to their prey? And so what you see on the upper right are 4 still images from a video camera that show us exactly when the mouth of that whale opens. And then on the bottom panel here, you see this black line that kind of yo-yos up and down. It has these little white circles on it. Those are the places where the whale actually is feeding. And so we use a signal in the tag data of when the animals accelerate. And then when that whale opens its mouth underwater, it slows down very quickly, like opening a parachute. The green line in the graph on the right indicates that acceleration of speed and then a very dramatic decrease. So we look for that signal in our tag data to tell us when the whale actually feeds. The next thing to do is to overlay that with the prey in its environment to understand how much food the whale is actually getting. So behind that time depth profile on the bottom, you see this red and blue and green. The richer red colors are prey patches that are more dense, and the blue and green are less dense. So in this case, you see this very nice long prey layer, and overlaid on that, you see that the whale is feeding and is able to find or locate some of the very dense parts of those patches. So putting these 2 things together took years and years to be able to do logistically, whereas in other animal systems, it would be very simple. Another thing we can start to do is look and see how, as prey change their behavior, how does it influence what whales do? So what you see here, this is what we call a heat map. And this is sort of a cube showing from the surface to deep water across a 24-hour period going from dawn to the middle of the day to nighttime. How much feeding does a population of whales do? And in this case, these are Antarctic minke whales. So the yellow areas are where you have very high feeding rates. The dark blue is where you have the lowest. So what you see is from dawn until about early dusk, you see that there's a little bit of lighter blue in the deep feeding area. And then that kind of moves up. And then you have this very intense foraging at night in the surface water. So why animals would be doing this and showing these kinds of patterns makes sense if you look at what the prey are doing. So this now shows you what prey are doing during the daytime. And it's hard to read the little numbers, but basically there's no prey up at the surface. You see these kind of yellow and green blobs. That red line is basically the bottom, and then the black is just absolutely below the seafloor. But what you see during the day is that prey patches are down deep and they're not particularly dense. The whales are not foraging all that much, but when they are, they're foraging deep. Contrast that to what happens to the prey at night. Those prey come up to the surface and consolidate into much denser patches, those red patches that you can see. The whales are taking advantage of that and modifying their behavior to say, I'm going to feed when it's the most efficient for me, when the prey is near the surface, I don't have to dive for it, and the bang for the buck is greater because those prey patches are more dense. So understanding things like this about how daytime patterns or diurnal patterns in these animals change their behavior can be really important for understanding or developing management strategies. So we took this kind of information and wanted to think about how can we learn how much a whale eats and how whales then relate as part of their ecosystem. And this is a study that we published in Nature. Matt Savoca, who was a postdoc in Jeremy Goldbogen's lab at Stanford at Hopkins Marine Station just down the road, was the lead author, and a huge number of folks contributed to this, but a really, really cool study. So in order to understand how much they eat, we need to know how big their mouths were. And like it was mentioned at the beginning of this talk, commercial whaling was an absolutely destructive and devastating enterprise in the 20th century, where more than 2 million whales were killed in the Southern Ocean alone. Some of the benefit of that was that there were some very meticulous notes taken at these whaling stations on the size of the anatomy structures in these animals. So on the top left, what you see there is a blue whale that's being taken apart. And there were some scientists that took measurements of these animals as they came through. Jeremy Goldbogen, who is at Stanford now, did this study a little while back where he measured how much water a baleen whale could take in its mouth at one time relative to its body size. And it's pretty amazing. So if you were a 12-meter long whale, probably a minke whale, a very small whale, when you open your mouth and take a gulp of water, you can get about 75% of your body weight in your mouth at one time. So if you're a 10-ton whale, you can get 7.5 tons of water in your mouth at one time, which is pretty amazing. But what's more amazing is that this scales with body size. And as you get to be the size of a blue whale at 24 meters, you're actually engulfing 133% of your body weight. So if you're a 100-ton blue whale, you can get 133% of your body weight in water in your mouth at one time, which means you can eat enormous amounts of food and be incredibly efficient. And this is a real game changer for us. So what we've been able to do now is model or show, as you get bigger in the number of different species, how your body grows volumetrically allows you to get more and more food in your body at one time. So obviously, blue whales and fin whales, the biggest animals, proportionally are going to be able to consume or engulf much, much more water at one time than any other animal. Now, if you look at, though, how often the whales feed, we see that as you are bigger, you feed fewer times because it takes so much energy to open your mouth and to process that water and push it through your baleen plates. The blue and fin whales on this graph, you see their numbers for the estimated feeding rates in terms of lunges per day is about 200 or 250. Whereas a humpback whale, which is about half the size, you can see they can lunge sometimes over 1,000 times in a day, but they average about 400 times in a day. So a humpback whale can feed about twice as frequently as a blue whale does. But when you multiply the engulfment or the amount of water that the animal can filter in its mouth at one time by the number of times it feeds, blue whales far and away exceed the amount of water that gets filtered relative to other animals. And on this scale here, this is not logarithmic, but it's not linear. So a blue whale can basically filter about 30,000 cubic meters of water per day, whereas a humpback whale can do about 7,000, a minke whale maybe about 6,000. So a blue whale can filter 5 times more water than a minke whale can in a given day, which means that it can take in that much more food and sustain its large body size. Okay, now when we go out and we do this thing where we measure the prey around the whales when they're feeding, and this portion was laid by Dave Cade, who's a postdoc in my lab at Santa Cruz and was at Stanford before, it allows us to get at what is the actual consumption rate, how much food are these whales actually consuming. And what we found in the top panel here basically shows blue whales, fin whales, and humpback whales. And initially, before we did this, if you just based energetic needs on the body size of the animal, you would have estimated that a blue whale would have eaten about 3 or 4 tons of food in a given day. And what we find is that that is more likely about 15 or 16 tons in a day. And a humpback whale, which we thought might eat half a ton to a single ton, is actually eating about 6 tons of food a day. So the amount that these animals are feeding and eating is dramatically more than we thought it might be once we were able to actually make these measurements using empirical data. Okay, so how does this information allow us to understand these animals relative to their environment better and develop better kind of conservation and management strategies? Well, we wanted to start thinking about baleen whales as ecosystem engineers. And ecosystem engineers are animals that modify or maintain or create habitat either directly or indirectly by modulating the availability of resources for another species. A beaver is a great example of an ecological engineer. As they fell trees and create dams, they're creating ponds of water in areas that otherwise wouldn't have it, and they're creating habitat for all of these other animals. Well, whales are actually doing something very similar. They're doing it in a kind of a different way, though. What you see here is a whale that is defecating. And in that defecation is a huge amount of nutrient that otherwise might be limiting in the ocean. So this has been called the whale pump, where whales basically eat a huge amount of food, they process that food, they bring that up to the surface, and that surface water, in order to have productivity and photosynthesis occur, you need to have both nutrients and sunlight. And typically nutrients like iron specifically are limited in these surface waters. But if whales are eating all this food and then defecating at the surface, there's this influx of iron into the environment that may help to stimulate growth and productivity, which would then help to create a better food base for the whales. So in a way, whales can be thought of as creating more food the more that they eat, or creating conditions to promote productivity the more that they eat and the more whales that are in a certain area. This is the whale pump in action. If you don't believe me, this is a tag that slid on the underside of a fin whale, and you're going to get a very close-up and personal view of iron fertilization by a fin whale into the environment. It's a little crude, but it is really quite dramatic, and it's pretty amazing what these animals are actually able to do if you can model and understand how much they're eating and how much they are then putting back into the environment. So what this shows us here is how much iron would have been put into a system by baleen whales depending on how long they feed for, and then if their numbers were what they were before whaling and what they are today. So I want you to focus on the blue whales on the right. That bottom line there is effectively the amount of iron that is recycled today, given the population of blue whales in the world, which is about 10,000 worldwide. There are about 360,000 blue whales killed in the 20th century in commercial whaling. And what you see, the blue line that has a large slope that is if blue whales before whaling, we were able to estimate how much iron they were recycling. And so that arrow going up and down, let's call it 120 days. If whales were feeding for 120 days of the year, you see that they would be recycling about 5,000 tons of iron in a given year relative to about 0 that they're doing right now. So that's a major change in the amount of a very limiting nutrient that whales are not putting back into the environment and helping to promote the growth of their prey. So it really speaks to one of the reasons that having whales in your system is very important. Okay, it's not all bad news for whales, and I think it's really important to, when we do conservation and we do management, to be able to measure success and to celebrate some successes that we do have. This is a good example of successes that are occurring right now. Humpback whales in the Antarctic, their populations are going through the roof. We have measured pregnancy rates in these animals that are higher there than anywhere else in the world. We're finding that humpback whales, which typically take 2 or 3 years in between calving, in the Antarctic, 12% of the females are both pregnant and lactating at the same time. And they're doing so because there's a lot of food around, and they're doing this in the absence of other whales like blue whales and fin whales that haven't recovered yet from industrial whaling. So these populations are recovering, and we need to be able to say that's a great success story, and we need to understand those animals and the things that they rely on, while also trying to promote the recovery of those species that take a little bit longer to do so. Okay, now one of the things that we've tried to do working with a group like the World Wildlife Fund is to take the data and the information that we are gathering on whales in the Antarctic and in other parts of the planet and put it all together and try and tell a story about how this science can better inform management and policy at broad scales. And we recently did this study called the Protecting the Blue Corridors. You can go online and download the PDF. It's fantastic. It was a great effort that WWF led and a whole bunch of researchers from around the world. What we did is we basically went through and tried to come up with a number of key messages on why protecting whales has benefits for nature and people, like I just discussed, how blue corridors, which are the corridors that these whales use as they migrate from the areas that they feed to the areas that they breed in, and how those are critical ocean habitats for migratory marine species. Typically in conservation, we think about let's protect the areas where they feed and let's protect the nursery areas where they give birth. Those are critical areas, but there's all this space in between that is just as critical because that's exactly where the whales are. Wherever a whale is, it's critical to conserve and protect that. These migratory corridors are the things that have been sort of left out in the cold so far. As I mentioned, whales are an indicator of ocean health, but face a lot of growing threats. So being able to understand these and identify where the threats to these animals occur can make us a little more focused and capable of doing better conservation. And so what we do is we try and highlight a new conservation approach for enhanced cooperation, because these animals, as you'll see, migrate through the international waters as well as the national waters of a number of different countries. And if you have things set up in one country but not in another, as soon as those whales go into another country, those threats are going to be reestablished, and the conservation can effectively be for naught. So we wanted this to be a way to visualize where these animals go and the threats that they face, and how we can then focus our energies to being more vigilant. So this is the main graph that I want you to look at. What each of these lines are the tracks of whales where we've put satellite transmitters on the whales that actually show us the location of the animal over very long periods of time, months and months and months and months. The shading area basically shows you kind of where the corridors are over which all of the animals in the species migrate. And what's really amazing is that, and this is sort of a Southern Ocean dominated one because that's where a lot of the effort has been, but you can see that there's been a ton of work on the west coast of the US. You can also see where the lack of information is and the places that we need to be able to focus a little bit more attention on. Okay, one of the things that we did in this was to try and understand or showcase where different threats were for different animals at different times of the year in different places on the globe. Obviously, climate change is one that we need to be able to look at, and we have great data from that from a remote sensing perspective. Fisheries, obviously, is another huge one, and there are these great online data sets that can tell us about where fishing occurs and where the highest rates of activity are. And then things like shipping and vessel strikes are one of the main mortality factors for whales that migrate. And there's some great information out there on shipping and vessel traffic. So to be able to overlay these massive human threats with these corridors and the habitats that these whales use gives us a really nice visualization of the places where we need to focus our energies. So I want to just kind of end and show you guys a couple of examples of how we did this in this report. So what we're looking at here is the Eastern Pacific Ocean. You can see we're looking at both the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. And what we have here are tags for both humpbacks and blue whales. The orange are humpback whales, the blue are blue whales, which is very nice for us to do. And what you can see at the very bottom part is the Antarctic Peninsula where we work. You can see the tracks of those animals going up and down the west coast of South America into Central America. And those animals cross the coastlines of Argentina, of Chile, of Peru, of Ecuador, of Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica, 7 or 8 different countries that those animals are going very close to shore and in their territorial waters of. We can see that blue whales in those blue views up there, they use a slightly smaller area, but the density of those tracks is incredibly high. They're using almost all of the very coastal areas along the entire US West Coast and along the Mexican Baja California Peninsula and into the Sea of Cortez. And so with this knowledge, now we can look and see where are different industries hotspotting and how do they overlap with where these animals tend to be at different times of the year. This is one that's just sort of a look more specifically at Eastern North Pacific blue whales. And those top 2 panels that you see that are sort of the purple spectrums show ship traffic and the density of blue whale tracking data. And so we can do things now like literally put these on one another and look at them over discrete time periods like we have on the bottom, different times of the year. We need to be dynamic in understanding where the whales are and where human activities are, and look at these spatial temporal overlaps and be able to take this as evidence through these industries and use it as information and as a bargaining chip, basically, to show that there needs to be something to be done. Around the Antarctic, this is a really cool image looking at all the whales that have been tagged, of all the humpback whales that have been tagged. And what's great is you can see you have a number of different populations. These animals have very high site fidelity to breeding grounds on the west side and east side of South America, on the west side of Africa, the east and west sides of Australia, and even New Zealand. And what these animals do is they have these very nice direct migratory routes to those breeding grounds. And then once you get to the Antarctic, they spread out into these large feeding areas. Now, the Antarctic is one continent that is governed as itself. There aren't any other countries there. But what this also shows us is where the protected areas currently are for these animals and how much overlap there is with the tracks of these animals. And the example that I want to kind of leave you guys with is this wonderful paper that we did that Ryan Reisinger, who's a postdoc in our lab, is now at the University of Southampton, led in Nature to show how tracking data in the Southern Ocean can be used to show the efficiency of conservation to date. So we use 17 different species, not just marine mammals, but birds, seabirds and penguins and pinnipeds, seals, sea lions and whales. We had over 4,000 individuals that were tracked. And what we did is we let the tracks tell us about where these animals go and where the important areas are for these animals, and see how well the existing marine protected areas cover those. And what's really interesting is if you look at and the background here, the highlighted yellow areas, or those places outlined in white, are the ecologically important areas for a number of species. The existing marine protected areas are highlighted in orange, and then new proposed ones are highlighted in pink. And what's incredible is that if you let the animals tell you about where is important, we find that current marine protected areas only cover about 1/4 of the ecologically important areas for those animals. And even all the proposed ones only bump that level up to about 40%. So it's very clear that the way that we are developing marine protected areas is much more based on human activities or human interests rather than what the animals are telling us are the important areas for them. So knowing how important these animals are for the marine ecosystem that they're part of, it seems to make sense that the animals should have a little bit more say in where the areas are that we should define as ecologically important that need to be protected and preserved. I think I'll end there. Hopefully that was easy enough to follow. I hope it was able to be translated as well. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys and hopefully learn a little bit from you guys about how we can make our science a little better, how we can communicate it better, and how we can do things that have a more focused and direct impact on conservation that you guys are hopefully going to learn about. So thank you for having me. I'd love to invite anybody up to my lab at UC Santa Cruz that wants to come up and learn a little bit more about what we do, or just visit Santa Cruz in general. So thank you guys, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Hey, thanks so much, Dr. Friedlaender. That was outstanding. I mean, some of those visuals, just incredible. I'm kind of having second thoughts about my career path here that I didn't even do what you do. But I do get to do some cool stuff, and the students here as well. And so we definitely have a lot of questions. I see some in the chat. But one I just want to start with is, I'm doing some work right now on some of this ocean climate policy that got passed recently in the last couple of years. And one of the issues is kind of dynamic marine protected areas because of the climate issue, right? That, that setting up protected areas in a world that's so dynamic and volatile, that they have to be updated quickly. And I imagine with whales, with these huge migration patterns, that would feed into it. So I'm wondering how your work thinks about the shifting nature of kind of climate and whale migration, and how we build that into kind of conservation policy. Yeah,
that's a great question. What we need to do first is, so these animals, their life histories, their schedule of events are only successful if their environment is able to support them. So, for example, in the Antarctic, they require sunlight and ice-free areas for the krill to be there in a high enough abundance for them. That can only happen in a discrete window of time. And then the gestation length, is about 11 months in these animals. So they kind of have to be breeding at a certain time or giving birth at a certain time. And there's probably a little bit of wiggle room. But what we don't know is, as conditions change, are the animals going to totally shift when those seasons occur? And like you said, if that's the case, then we need to be vigilant. A great example is the Dungeness crab fishery that we have right here, right? And that, because it's so small scale, and it can be managed dynamically because it can be communicated and because it can be kind of contained, has done a really good job of saying, okay, if whales are present, we need to be vigilant to not do things that we know are going to entangle them. But the problem is that as conditions change, the timing of when those whales comes through is likely going to change. And I wouldn't also be then surprised if the time when the crabs are there might not also change, because there are certainly conditions that the crabs utilize in their life history to take advantage of. So it might be they all kind of move and shift at the same schedule, or it may not. That's a great question.
Well, thanks for that. We're going to need a lot of top scientists like you on the case, getting us the best data to update our management plans. I noticed some questions here in the chat. I think we'll go with Megan and then Deidre and then anybody else. So Megan, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi there. Thanks so much for your presentation. It was amazing. And I would love to watch like a live stream of those videos. If you have them up on a website, I just love to click into them random parts of the day. But thank you. I was just wondering, just talking about how Jason mentioned at the beginning, and then you addressed as well, how the whales were hunted nearly to extinction. I was thinking how that probably impacted like the genetic diversity in the populations. And I was wondering how that might have impacted maybe like certain behaviors or different natural rhythms. And then when you mentioned those poor females who are lactating and pregnant at the same time, sounds like a lot of work. So I was just wondering, is that like, it's definitely a success story because the populations are increasing, but is that like a survival adaptation because of the overwhaling, or if there's enough data? I know someone in the chat mentioned that if there's enough data to even make those connections. So I was just curious on that. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And I appreciate the comment. So a couple of things. So one of the things like bubble net feeding, which has been observed in the Pacific Northwest and off the US East Coast for 30, 40 years, is something that we are only seeing in the Antarctic in the last 10 or 15 years. And so actually what we're going down and doing is looking at the animals that we see doing those bubble nets and looking at their genomes and basically looking, are there certain haplotypes or frequencies of genes that are expressed or phenotypes in those animals that may predict bubble net feeding. And so to your point of sort of this change in genetic diversity, it might be that this is something that happened very commonly, but since you decimate the population, only a small number of those animals survive. If those animals were ones that bubble netted previously, then great, that might sort of be a demonstration that it is coming back into that population. And so we'll be looking at that for sure. In terms of the females and the reproductive rates, our inclination is that animals are going to naturally try and reproduce as fast and as quickly and as frequently as you possibly can, given the resources available to them. So we see a pregnant and lactating female as, yes, it's quite industrious, but it speaks to food being unlimited. Like for us, we don't really think about how much energy is required for you to get pregnant, to grow a fetus, to lactate, and to nourish yourself, right? Because we can go out and get food whenever we want. But for whales and other animals in their environment, you survive yourself first and then an offspring. So the fact that they can do those things to us is the sign of food is relatively unlimited and the animals have the capacity to grow that quickly.
Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And so Deidre, and then we'll get Libby.
Thank you, Ari. I really enjoyed the presentation. Libby, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I also really enjoyed that. It was so engaging with all those videos. And I have two questions. One is I actually also have been to Antarctica, so I have interest in that area and love seeing those videos. And I'm curious if you've done any work with CAMLR or working with them to set up marine protected areas, and just to hear your own opinions on what's going on right now in the Antarctic region.
Yeah, well, if you could see where I am, I have a punching bag next to me, and I will write CAMLR on there because it has turned into one of the most frustrating things possible. So, so baleen whales are managed by the International Whaling Commission. Started in the 40s to actually manage the whale fishery. It's turned into the conservation group that manages whales, especially in the Southern Ocean. CAMLR is the group that it's conservation for the conservation of Antarctic marine living resources. And they are charged with all of the other animals basically in the marine ecosystem in the Antarctic. They do not deal with whales, and whales have never been in the purview of CAMLR. So any decisions that have been made to date in CAMLR have been completely exclusive of baleen whales and their needs. And what we've tried to do in the last 10 years or so is work with Pew, work with WWF to get whales in that process. And for a long time, we didn't have the quality of data that was required to be able to put them into that context. Now, a lot of our data sets vastly exceed what is known for other seabirds and other animals that CAMLR actually does manage. And so we're pushing very, very hard to get whales utilized as a conservation need in CAMLR. The issue in CAMLR as well is that anything in CAMLR only passes through consensus. And it is a really antiquated kind of strategy because a lot of the groups that you have or the countries that are represented in CAMLR are the fishing countries that are commercially fishing for krill. We've shown that there are incredible overlaps in space and time between baleen whales and the krill fishery. There's been an increasing number of entanglements of whales in that industry. We're also showing that the krill fishery is removing enough so it's actually affecting the behavior and the reproductive rates of whales in those areas. But those fishing countries are never going to voluntarily support a measure that will limit krill fishing. So as long as one country has a vote and says no, nothing is going to get passed. And to me, it just seems like an absolutely absurd sort of strategy. And that's why I'm not good at politics, because I would just kind of lose my shit if I went to one of those meetings. I do it enough in our little science meetings, but we're doing everything we possibly can to insert whales into CAMLR wherever we can. But thank you for bringing that up. And yeah, that's a rage topic for me.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that that's something you're working on. I know that they're really focused on science, and I know that they're fantastic. A lot of people say that they're great as a fishery, like management, but not so much as creating marine protected areas, and that's what's being called to do now. So my other quick question is if you have done any work with offshore wind turbines, and I've always been curious about how that disrupts whale migrations. And also I know that there's talk of in the Drake's Passage too, of submerging the turbines so that they're generating energy from the currents, and how that affects whale migrations.
Yeah, those are great questions. We've done a ton of work with the Navy to look at the impact of disturbance on marine mammals, mostly from sound. And the wind energy that is on the horizon, literally and figuratively on the horizon, is something that we have been able to get in at the ground level for. And I think the largest disturbance from those is going to be the vessel traffic going out and putting in these turbines, and probably the acoustic disturbance to an area as you're putting in these platforms. But once those things are established and are in place, it's no more than a physical obstacle, for the animals. And so the work that has been done to date on migrating animals has shown that animals will basically just sort of move around something like that as an impediment in their way. I don't think that it would have a long-term impact on the migration routes of these animals, but it's something that can be dynamic, right? If we know that gray whales and humpback whales migrate through here in February to April. You know what? Maybe we shouldn't have a lot of ship traffic going out there and building in February through April, and it seems like a very common sense thing to be able to minimize that overlap of the threat. And my hope is that wind energy, because it's such a conscious bearing type of resource, way of doing things, will take that into account.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's great to know about the long-term impacts. We're working a lot on the offshore wind, and I think what you're saying about the construction being limited to times when the whales aren't there, that's kind of that matches with what the scientists we've been talking with as well. So that's awesome.
Great.
Rachel, go for it.
I hate to steal a question, but I'm just dying to ask, has there been any movement on predictive modeling toward, exactly what you're showing us with, the overlap of the ship traffic or the, the migration routes and thinking of that, has there been any forward motion on, stopping ship strikes then and looking at those patterns together and then doing something?
Yeah, there have been. And the ways that, again, sort of like that first example with the Dungeness fishery, it seems to work at relatively small scales. So for example, on the US East Coast with right whales, we know that their habitats have shifted in the Gulf of Maine and the Bay of Fundy as their prey has shifted where it is going. And because of that, the Canadian government has actually moved physically the shipping lanes in those areas that did overlap or that do now overlap with the known distribution of those animals. Of course, those animals then go into the US and we don't do a damn thing about it. And so those same animals that Canada is doing a wonderful job of trying to remove the threat from are still at risk, in the US. One of the things that is being done in the US is sort of a dynamic strategy of having a network of hydrophones. And if animals are heard on any of those phones, that immediately sends out a communication to any ship in that area that then has to change its speed, not change its area, but change its speed to something that would produce a non-lethal strike if it actually happened. So it's happening in very small bits and pieces. On the West Coast here of the US, we know that there is a huge amount of overlap from ships going from San Francisco down the Santa Barbara Channel. And blue whales are probably the most at risk in that respect. One of the things that's been proposed is that companies that are very coastal, enough shipping lanes that are very coastal, can only burn a certain type of fuel and has a higher, basically a higher floor for emissions. So you have to burn a cleaner burning gas that's more expensive. And so one option is, if you tell the shipping companies, if you just go a little bit offshore, you can burn a cheaper gas and it's going to be less of an economic burden for you, and you can still go and make a faster speed through there. The issue in that sense is then you're burning, dirtier fuel, and you're producing something that has, sort of another negative impact. So I don't know that there's not a universal answer, but it certainly seems like for these places where animals go through multiple countries, there needs to be partnership and cooperation, and that Blue Corridors report puts forth a couple of ideas for that.
Right. Great. Well, I think if there's one more question from the student group here, we'd be happy to take that.
I got one actually. You seem to there seems to be a lot more technology at play. Like the drones seem very recent, and then the buoy. Would this have been possible until recently? What factor has been the technology to get all this data, basically?
Yeah. These tags have been around for 15, 20 years. The satellite tags have been around for longer, but these suction cup tags have been around for not very long. The technology certainly drives our ability to learn more about these animals, but we're still kind of logistically constrained. You still got to get in a boat. You still got to go out there and put a tag on a whole lot of whales, and that's going to take a lot of time to do. But fortunately, I'm becoming a dinosaur. My students now are the ones that are going out and, it's like that old, maybe at least Jason will remember that commercial about a hair product, I think, where it's you tell one friend, they tell one friend, and, you see the number of people that are then informed increase very quickly. And my hope is that the generation that has been blessed with the ability to sort of develop this technology, we have this F1 generation that is going to be much bigger than us, that has a greater sort of capacity to go out there and do this. But it still takes time. And these animals live lifetimes like we do. And so in some ways you can't speed up what we, how you learn about the biology of a long-lived animal. In some ways, and so that will put a little bit of a governor on the speed that we can do things.
Hey, well, Dr. Friedlaender, I want to respect your time here. We've gone a little over, but I want to for everybody here, I want to say that was just an outstanding presentation. Really, really one of the highlights of the semester. We're definitely going to take you up on a trip to your lab in the spring. So let's give Dr. Friedlaender a round of applause here and wish him the best on helping us manage these amazing creatures. And have a great holiday season, and again, thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you guys. It's my pleasure. I really get a lot out of interacting with bright minds like you guys, and the program that you guys have at Middlebury is phenomenal. And I hope we can do more of this kind of work together.
All right. Awesome. All right, everybody. Have a great evening. Be well.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you.